Hello, and welcome to the 55th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNI, your host, and today's topic is adaptation, the fastest growing member of the sustainability family and the one that shows up to the party wearing sensible shoes. Adaptation is the current buzzword for sustainable development, an investment headed into 2026 and sounds simple. It is the deliberate strengthening of people, ecosystems, and infrastructure to reduce harm and maintain function as climate hazards and other environmental stresses intensify and shift. No one can deny the world's average temperature is rising at a dangerous rate. Hazards are shifting, so we must now adjust how we live, build, insure, farm, power, and govern. In practice, adaptation is the safe space alternative to the faltering efforts to thwart global warming, where physics meets budgets, and where time horizons go to enter full-throated debate. From a sustainable development perspective, investment into adaptation projects is one of the few areas still earmarked for growth this year. For years, the sustainability world treated adaptation like the quiet sibling of mitigation, meaning the efforts to reduce CO2 emissions to net zero in the next decade. That is changing quickly, partly because the hazard map is changing quickly. Mitigation is about preventing causes of global warming. Adaptation is about dealing with the consequences. Mitigation asks how we stop adding to the problem. Adaptation asks what we do while the problem keeps showing up for work every day. The intellectual roots of adaptation go back decades. Development economics has always dealt with climate variability, drought cycles, floodplains, and food security. Public health has also grappled with heat, vector-borne disease, and sanitation that assume weather extremes. What changed is the baseline. The climate is no longer a stable platform with occasional outliers. The outliers are becoming a new kind of normal, and planning based on 20th century distributions has started to look like running a modern data center on a dial-up modem. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit and entered into force in 1994. This conference framed adaptation as a legitimate response alongside mitigation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN-backed scientific assessment body set up in 1988 that synthesizes climate science on impacts, risks, mitigation, and adaptation for policymakers, began mapping impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation in more depth across assessment cycles. Over time, the conversation shifted from adaptation as a moral claim for support, mainly from vulnerable countries, toward adaptation as an economic and financial agenda for every country with assets, people, and tax receipts. The last 10 years has added two accelerants. One is better climate science meeting, better geospatial data, turning abstract risk into address-level exposure. The other is capital markets, learning that climate risk is about stranded assets in real estate, infrastructure, logistics, and human productivity. When lenders, insurers, and rating agencies begin to understand and price risk as quantifiable, adaptation becomes a line-item subject to negotiations in the development process. A recent McKinsey Global Institute piece usefully frames the adaptation problem through evolving hazards, using common protection standards and climate model ensembles to illustrate how exposure changes between today 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees Celsius of rising average global temperature. The takeaway is that local climate hazards shift in different ways, at different speeds, and with different impacts on people and capital. Heat stress is a good example because it is chronic. The McKinsey definition focuses on sustained periods of at least 4 weeks of high heat or humid heat conditions that materially reduce labour productivity and increase health risk. Land exposed to heat stress increases roughly 25% at 1.5 degrees, compared with today, and more than 50% at 2 degrees. Regions already exposed see longer duration, moving from roughly 12 weeks to more than 16 weeks in some places. That is a month of additional drag on work, health, and systems that assume humans can function outdoors for long stretches. Heat waves behave differently. They are rarer, more episodic, locally defined extremes. The mapping suggests that land exposed to a meaningful likelihood of heat waves expands dramatically by 1.5 degrees, and by 2 degrees could cover a very large share of global land. The practical point is that protection can be relatively low cost when it is planned. Early warning systems, cooling shelters, public health outreach, and grid resilience to keep cooling available. Drought is another hazard that turns quickly into macroeconomics. The share of global agricultural land exposed to rare drought events expands sharply with warming. At 1.5 degrees, exposure increases almost threefold compared with today. At 2 degrees, exposure increases almost fourfold, and rare droughts can last more than a year in some regions. Agriculture, hydropower, and municipal water systems all sit on that foundation. Flood hazards also shift, and the numbers become dangerous quickly when you translate them into infrastructure design and insurance. Coastal flooding, defined as a very rare event with at least knee-deep inundation, becomes far more frequent. A 1 in 100 year coastal flood event is mapped as becoming something closer to a 1 in 13 year event by mid-century under a 2-degree world. Riverine flooding sees smaller global shifts in extent, with some increase in frequency and depth. Excess rainfall flooding expands in reach, with enough of an increase to overwhelm drainage systems, disrupt cities, and turn basements into unplanned swimming pools. This hazard-based framing matters because it tells us what adaptation really is, namely, a portfolio across hazards, sectors, and timelines. It includes physical measures like seawalls, levees, stormwater systems, cooling infrastructure, and wildfire buffers. It includes nature-based measures like mangroves, wetlands, floodplains, forest management, and soil restoration. Social measures are also needed, like early warnings, evacuation plans, building codes, zoning, and healthcare readiness. Financial measures like insurance reform, risk pooling, contingent credit lines, and catastrophe bonds are also part of the new picture. Data measures also matter and extend into areas like hazard mapping, monitoring, and operational analytics. Adaptation is messy because reality is messy. So, where has adaptation worked in ways that are tangible today? Let's start with cyclones. Bangladesh is often cited for progress in reducing cyclone mortality through better forecasting, early warning, shelters, and community preparedness. The hazard did not disappear, but the country's vulnerability has changed. That is adaptation at its best, relatively low cost, repeatable, and focused on saving lives. Let's also look at water management. The Netherlands can practically be viewed as a long-running engineering project with a flag. Centuries of dikes, surge barriers, spatial planning, and institutional capability have created a society that treats flood risk as a core function of the state. That approach is expensive, disciplined, and brutally rational. It is also a reminder that adaptation is not new. The difference now is the scale of the challenge and the speed of change. Many cities have started to build heat action plans, early warning protocols, and targeted support for vulnerable populations. Simple measures like cooling centres, adjusted work hours, and public messaging save lives. Urban design measures, trees, reflective surfaces, shade structures, and better building envelopes reduce temperatures and reduce the cooling load on grids. Another area is coastal ecosystems. Mangrove restoration can reduce storm surge impacts, support fisheries, and store carbon. It is not a universal substitute for hard infrastructure, and it requires land, governance, and maintenance. When done well, it is adaptation that pays multiple dividends. Insurance and finance have also shown development. Many regions have expanded catastrophe risk pools and parametric insurance for rapid payout after disasters. Think of mandatory flood insurance at the national government level in the United States, something the Trump administration has yet to topple. The adaptation benefit is speed. Recovery becomes faster, displacement becomes shorter, and fiscal shocks become more manageable. Now let's look at some failures, because adaptation is often invisible until it is absent. The simplest failure mode is building in the wrong place, then being surprised when disaster arrives. It's a problem as old as mankind. Floodplains, fire-prone interfaces, and low-lying coasts are attractive for development until the hazard bill comes due. Rebuilding the same assets in the same footprints, with the same codes and the same drainage, is a subscription model for repeat losses. Just ask any Angelenos you meet as Los Angeles continues to recover from last year's firestorm devastation. Another failure mode is underinvesting in boring infrastructure. Stormwater networks, culverts, maintenance regimes, reservoir operations, and grid hardening are neither glamorous nor high-yield investments. Yet their absence can be catastrophic. When extreme rainfall overwhelms drainage, the damage is water in streets with a dose of transport paralysis, business interruption, hospital disruption, sewage overflow, and contaminated water. Ignoring cascading risk magnifies failure mode. A heat wave drives electricity demand, reduces generation efficiency in thermal plants, stresses transmission, and threatens blackouts. Wildfire risk threatens substations, lines, air quality, and insurance markets. Coastal flooding hits ports, fuel terminals, and industrial clusters. Adaptation fails when systems are managed in silos. Social vulnerability is the failure mode most likely to be found on nightly news. Hazards hit hardest for elderly people, low-income households, informal settlements, and communities without political voice face higher exposure and lower recovery capacity. Adaptation that ignores equity is ineffective. A city is only as resilient as its least protected neighbourhood, since disruption spreads through labour markets, health systems, and public finances. Now, to the issue that sits below the surface of every adaptation conversation in 2026, human bias. We are optimised for the near term. We discount the future, prefer visible benefits, reward leaders for ribbon cuttings, not for disasters that did not happen. Adaptation asks for spending today to avoid a loss tomorrow, with the added inconvenience that the loss is probabilistic. That is a hard political sell. In corporate finance terms, adaptation often looks like an insurance premium. It reduces downside volatility, protects cash flow, and preserves option value. Yet, adaptation rarely creates a new revenue line in year one. Many decision makers still treat it as discretionary, especially when budgets are tight and when voters demand immediate services. This bias produces predictable outcomes. Adaptation spending spikes after disasters, then fades during calm years. Maintenance gets deferred, codes remain outdated, and zoning remains permissive. Insurance premiums rise, then politics tries to cap them, which pushes risk back onto public balance sheets. The way out is to make adaptation investable in ways that fit real-world incentives. That means linking adaptation to measurable performance, reductions in outage minutes, flood depth, downtime, claims, and health impacts. It means building finance structures that value resilience. Resilience-linked loans, performance-based grants, and insurance pricing that rewards risk reduction. And there has been real progress in putting adaptation into capital planning, not just treating it as an emergency fund. So, which countries and investors are leading the adaptation charge? Let's remind ourselves that leadership often comes from necessity. Small island states and low-lying delta nations have been pushing adaptation for decades because the alternative is existential. Many Asian countries invest heavily in flood control, water systems, and cyclone preparedness. European countries, with dense infrastructure and strong planning systems, have expanded adaptation strategies and funding. The United States invests massively in disaster recovery and increasingly in resilience, though the allocation is often reactive and politically contested. At the investor level, the story is more mixed. Multilateral development banks remain central because adaptation in emerging markets often needs concessional finance, long tenors, and risk sharing. Climate funds such as the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund play catalytic roles, though global demand exceeds supply. Bilateral agencies in Europe, Japan, and North America finance adaptation through development programs and export finance when projects align with national priorities. Private capital is showing up in specific segments: resilience infrastructure with contracted revenue, water utilities with regulated returns, data and analytics platforms, and nature-based solutions when there are clear monetization pathways. Reinsurers and insurers are also major actors because adaptation reduces their loss ratios, at least when markets remain viable. The frontier question ahead revolves around scale. Adaptation is often local and fragmented, yet finance demands scale, standardization, and replicability. The winning model is likely to be portfolios, bundled projects across municipalities, standardized designs, pooled procurement, and blended finance structures that turn many small investments into an asset class. This next step is perfect for private equity and potentially extremely profitable. Now, the uncomfortable question: could the cooling enthusiasm for carbon reduction spill over into adaptation? The risk exists for a simple reason: adaptation competes with everything. If political support for climate action weakens, leaders may try to avoid the entire topic. They may frame adaptation as an admission of defeat, or they may avoid spending on future risk while trying to protect current budgets. And there is another pathway to decline: adaptation fatigue. If hazards keep worsening and losses keep rising, some communities may conclude that adaptation is pointless. That is usually not true in technical terms, since many measures save lives and reduce damage. Yet, it can become true in political terms if adaptation is sold as a promise of safety rather than a strategy of risk reduction. The way to prevent that drift is to position adaptation as core economic management rather than climate virtue. Adaptation protects productivity, property values, supply chains, food systems, and fiscal stability. It is public finance 101 with better weather data. When framed that way, adaptation remains relevant, even when the climate culture wars tumble out of control. Now let's bring it all home to sustainable energy developers, since many of our listeners sit in that world. Energy is both a victim and an enabler of adaptation. It is a victim because climate hazards threaten generation assets, transmission, substations, ports, and construction schedules. It is an enabler because many adaptation measures require power: cooling, pumping, desalination, early warning systems, communications, hospitals, and resilient housing. Developers benefit from adaptation in several practical ways. Project bankability improves when climate risk is addressed up front. Lenders increasingly ask about physical risk: flood exposure, wildfire exposure, heat impacts on performance, water availability, and access risk. A project that can demonstrate resilience measures, redundancy, and emergency response planning can reduce financing friction. Operational performance also improves. Heat reduces PV efficiency. It also increases cooling demand in nearby communities, which changes load profiles and grid stress. Storage and demand response become adaptation assets as much as market assets, since they keep power stable during heat peaks and storm events. Permitting and community acceptance improve when projects solve local resilience needs. A solar plus storage project that supports a community microgrid for critical services has a different social license than a project that only exports electrons. Co-location with water infrastructure, agricultural resilience, or cooling shelters turns clean energy into a visible local benefit. Just look at the example of a sustainable, fire-resistant high school being built in Malibu in the aftermath of last year's fire devastation. Revenue stability improves when electricity grids are hardened and when flexibility markets evolve. Curtailment, outages, and congestion are financial risks. Investments in grid resilience and flexibility reduce those risks. Developers should care about adaptation because it protects their revenue line, not only because it looks responsible in a slide deck. Construction and supply chains also benefit from adaptation planning. Extreme rainfall and heat affect labour productivity and safety. Wildfire smoke affects work stoppages. Scheduling, modularisation, worker protections, and contingency planning are adaptation tools that reduce delay risk. There is also a strategic angle. As adaptation spending rises, demand for power, cooling, water treatment, and pumping demand rises. Demand for data, communications, and health systems also rises. This type of growth is not always pleasant, since it reflects stress, not prosperity. Yet it is still urgent demand, and it means that clean, resilient power becomes more valuable in stressed systems. So, what are the real benefits of adaptation beyond the abstract promises? The first benefit is fewer deaths and fewer injuries. Heat plans, early warnings, cyclone shelters, and resilient health systems deliver measurable outcomes. Next is lower economic loss. Flood defences, drainage upgrades, wildfire buffers, and building codes reduce damage and business interruption. Another benefit is fiscal stability. Disasters are balance sheet events for governments. Adaptation reduces the size and frequency of those shocks. And where would we be without insurability? Many regions are approaching thresholds where insurance becomes unaffordable or unavailable. Adaptation can keep markets functioning, which protects mortgages, property values, and municipal tax bases. We should also list investor confidence. When climate hazards become clearly priced into assets, markets can become volatile. Adaptation can dampen that volatility by reducing tail risk. System reliability is another real benefit. Power, water, transport, and communications are the backbone of modern economies. Adaptation protects uptime, and uptime is the quiet foundation of productivity. Now, where do we expect adaptation to go from here, realistically, in 2026? Our outlook focuses on 3 evolving trends. One is better targeting. Hazard mapping will drive prioritization. Heat stress, flooding, drought, and wildfire risk will be translated into capital plans with geospatial precision. This will also create political tension, since it forces explicit choices about which areas to protect first. Another trend is mainstreaming into finance. More adaptation will be embedded in normal infrastructure spending rather than labelled as climate spending. That comes under the category of real progress. The goal is to build assets that survive their design life. The third is a move toward portfolios and platforms. Cities and utilities will become bundle projects. Private capital will follow when projects are standardized and revenue-backed. Insurance will become a lever, rewarding risk reduction through pricing, deductibles, and coverage terms. On the downside, there will be friction. Some places will face limits where adaptation becomes prohibitively expensive relative to the value of assets at risk. Managed retreat will remain politically explosive, even when it is economically rational. The world will keep learning, often the hard way, that adaptation is easier when done early. The most important message for our listeners is to treat adaptation as more of a discipline than a slogan. It is a continuous cycle that requires assessing hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. The development that meets these standards demands the ability to measure, finance, implement, maintain, and update as hazards evolve. It is an enterprise based upon continued governance. If you work in sustainable energy, adaptation has quickly become a bigger dial on your risk dashboard, with the sub-dials showing design basis, community value proposition, and market thesis. Clean electrons that stay on during stress events are now the objective of the exercise. Well, that's a wrap on our 55th GreenWave podcast episode. We love reminding you how much we appreciate you sharing your time. Find us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please follow the pod, enjoy the pod, 5-star review the pod, and share with friends. If you have missed any of our LinkedIn posts or the GreenWave Gazette, you can always catch us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, Instagram, or visit synergy-international.net. We'll keep reflecting on the trends shaping sustainable finance and global policy. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.